CHM's Exponential Center is dedicated to exploring the people and the companies and communities in Silicon Valley around the world that are transforming the world through the intersection of technology and humanity, really looking at how technology innovation and economic value creation and social impact make a difference for us. One of the key questions that we're asking really is thinking about what theories and best practices really enable or accelerate exponential change and impact. So we're very fortunate tonight to have Clayton Christensen, a scholar who has made studying innovation and disruptive innovation his life's work. An acclaimed thought leader, he's explored innovation in business, in healthcare, in education, and most recently in economic development. He will offer remarks for the first part of the program, followed by discussion and conversation with Intuit founder Scott Cook. Together, they are the dream team to talk about these important topics with important implications for all of us. Clayton Christensen is the Kim B. Clark Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School and is regarded as one of the world's top experts in innovation. The Economist named his work, The Innovator's Dilemma, one of the 6 most important books about business ever written. And he's applied his theories on disruptive innovation not only for leading companies around the world, but also thinking about how that can change our own lives, such as in his New York Times bestseller, How Will You Measure Your Life? Tonight, he's going to share with us a sneak peek into his recent work on what he calls the prosperity paradox. Now, in our exponential tradition, I'll use 5 numbers to introduce him tonight. 26 is the number of years on the Harvard Business School faculty. 2, the number of times voted most influential management thinker in the world. 17,609, the number of citations of his seminal book, The Innovator's Dilemma. 11, the number of books authored with 1 more on the way. And 5, the amazing children that he and Christine have. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Clayton Christensen. So glad to have you here, Clay. Welcome. Thank you.
Sorry, you guys. I have had some challenges with health, and I'm sorry that it has to take up so much time. As Marguerite mentioned, the puzzle that I've been puzzling is when I typically meet somebody in America, they appear to me to be prosperous people. And yet, if you look at in the 1850s, the same person would be widely regarded as a basket case. I was a missionary for our church in Korea, and at the time, Korea was viewed by everybody as the most impoverished nation in Asia. And yet today, they're viewed as very prosperous. In the same way, in the Philippines, at the same time, the Philippines was regarded as a basket case, and they still are regarded as a basket case. And the question is, why is this? And so for the last number of years, we've been studying the process by which nations become prosperous people, and the process by which people mired in poverty stay there. The way we have approached it is like so many things. Data, God hasn't provided us data. And we really had to develop theories or statements of causality in order to have a sense for the process and predictability of becoming prosperous. And I want to just talk with you a little bit because our methods are a little bit different. But I'm proud of the way we do it. And we do this in our school by developing theories. And for a while I thought that theories are used in engineering and science. But a bit ago I realized that that's not just true. That managers use theories a lot. Because theories are statements of causality, a statement of what causes what and why. And when we think of it in these terms, every time we take an action that's predicated upon a theory, a statement of cause and effect in our lives, that if we do this, this will be the result we need. Every time a manager puts a plan into place, you and your colleagues believe that if you do this, you'll get the result you need. Every time every time we make an investment, it's predicated upon a theory that if we do this, we'll get the result we need. Consultants and analysts are actually voracious consumers of theory. And so you'll see our use of theory in a number of ways. I use theories a lot in my classes. When the class prepares in the MBA program, this is how I tell them to prepare for class. The first one is, we ask each of our students to read a theory of causality. And these are statements that we come from colleagues in their research. And then we ask them to put that theory on aside for a minute and look at other theories that we have used in our course. And we ask the students to put the step page 3, which is a case, put the theory on like a set of glasses and examine what's going on in a case. And the question is, can the theory tell us what's been going on in the company and why? And the students have to make a they have to promise me that when they're in class, I don't want to hear their opinions about what's going on in the case. All I want to know is, does the theory have an opinion about the issue in the case? Because we're trying to get our students to think about how to think. And that's been quite helpful. So we've applied these methods to a question of prosperity that I was described. And thankfully, this book is going to be finished on the marketplace in about 6 weeks. And these are a few of the theories that have been useful as we published or studied this question. The first theory is that there are 3 types of innovations. There are new market disruptions, they are sustaining innovations, and disruptive innovations. And I'll describe what they mean. You notice that I've got these 3 circles, and they represent populations of people who have progressively less money and less skill. And so usually in an industry, they begin in the center of the industry because the first products are complicated and expensive. Then as you get to the larger populations of population. You move into fewer people who have less money and less skill. So, for example, the mainframe computer was sold only to the rich and the wealthy. The largest universities and the largest colleges could only have one mainframe. But the personal computer made it so much more affordable and accessible that millions of people could now own and use the computer. And then the smartphone makes it even more affordable and accessible. And in every step, by making it affordable and accessible, it makes it affordable to a larger population of people. When the car was developed, for the first 30 years, the car was viewed as a toy for the rich. And then Henry Ford came along and developed the Model T in the early part of the 1908. And it made it so affordable and accessible that a much larger population of people could own and use a car. And then when I was in college in the 1960s, Toyota came into the market to sell their product to an even lower end of humanity, college students. But by making it affordable and accessible, a much larger population of people could have access to it. So I've gone too far on that one, but I just want you to say that in our attempts, market creations is one type of innovation, and when you make it affordable and accessible, it creates growth. Here's a way to utilize this theory to understand it. Some of you own a car called a Tesla, and we would all hope to have a Tesla. But the theory says that investments in a Tesla won't create jobs or growth because they're expensive. And when you go to the high end of a market, it stays in the middle, and it has to compete against BMW and Mercedes and Porsche and many others. When you go to Beijing, when you come out to the window in the morning, go to the look to the left and then to the right. And if you walk about 30 yards on one of those dimensions, you will have come across an electric car. And go up and touch it. It's an elegant device. It's narrow, so if your spouse is with you, you have to fold her up and put her in the back seat. But they are sold for a different purpose, and that is these are complicated roads and systems, and it has to be narrow because the roads are narrow. On the other hand, if you make it at the price it is, there's a totally different market at the low end of humanity with these Teslas or with these plastic cars. Go up and touch it. And what the theory says is that the people who are selling Teslas, we hope that they will survive. That's not my opinion, but the theory says that's what will happen. But if you look at the bottom of the market, the theory says that that's where new markets will begin and publish. So it's just an example of a market creating innovation created by people who are focused on affordability and accessibility. So the first type of innovation is a market-creating innovation. It creates jobs. The second type of innovation are sustaining innovations. Their purpose is to make good products better. And they don't create jobs either. And the way to visualize this is if you're a sales guy and you sell a Prius for Toyota, that's the good news. The bad news is if the customer buys your Prius, they won't buy a Camry. If you sell them this year's product, you won't buy last year's product. And so by their very nature, sustaining innovations whose purpose is to make good products better. The downside of that is that sustaining innovations don't create growth. And most of the innovations in the world around us are sustaining innovations. And it's important to keep our economy vibrant, but they don't create growth. Then the third type of innovation are efficiency innovations that allow good products to become cheaper. And they don't create growth either. Their purpose is to drive up free cash flow, and it is used for different purposes. Over our time, efficiency innovations around the world have been responsible for our inability to create growth in North America and in Asia. So these are three types of innovations. And in our model about where growth comes from, our assertion is that innovations are not innovations, but they're a type of innovation. And the ones that are market creating by making a product affordable and accessible, that's the type of innovation that creates growth for our economies. The other type of innovations, God bless them, but their purpose is not to drive growth in the company that you're studying. So, come back to my study. A company in the 1800s was named Singer, sewing machine company. And through the 1880s, if you wanted to have a new piece of clothing, you had to ask your wife or your children to make them by hand. And it took them about 8 hours to make a single piece of clothing. And so most people had one piece of clothing, and that's all. And there was very little more to do than to use the hand to the needle and help their family have something on their backs. Singer sewing machine figured out how to make that machine much more affordable. We have one in our basement, and it reduced the cost of making a piece of clothing from 2 hours or 8 hours to 2 hours. And it kept getting cheaper and cheaper. And this was a problem for Singer, because by making it affordable and accessible, so many more people wanted to buy the products. And that meant that you had to hire people to make these things. And then you had to have retail operations to sell the products. And then you had to teach the customers how to use them and understand how they could be applied. And sewing machines made by Singer, over the course of the first 2 years of its growth, made more than $2 million of jobs for their family, because they made it affordable and accessible. There's another company called Godrej, It's a prominent company in India. Several of their students were our students as well. And they made refrigerators, but they were complicated and costly. And so only the people who had the rich were able to own a refrigerator. Everybody else had to go to the market every day to have things that wouldn't spoil. Godrej decided that they were going to make a different type of technology that transformed a regular refrigerator, which cost about $150. They wanted to make it so affordable that you could sell it for $40. And they had to do it in a different way. So rather than using compression and electric cars, the traditional way, they used a different way that was called the Peltier effect. And you got a wire that went in this direction, and you connected it with copper from the other direction, and connected it. And when it did so, that intersection created coolness. And but they could sell an electric car, an electric refrigerator for about $30. And by making it so small and affordable, many more people could own and use a refrigerator. And that meant that they had to hire more people to make them and to sell them and to be distributors. And then they had to bring in other customers because in their shops they had never been able to sell cool products. And now they could. And by making it affordable and accessible, Godrej created a very big new business in the part of the nation where they're used. I mentioned to you earlier that when I was a young man, I served our church in Korea. And at the time that I served there, it was a desperately poor nation. And then something happened. And it was caused by a company whose name was Kia. Have you heard of these guys? When I was there, the only way you could get anything from here to there was you had to get somebody who had a Kia. And you could see that it could take anything in the back seat. And we did. Then I finished my service in 1974. And as you can see, Kia added the fourth car. And it subsequently became a very different company. But in the process, it had to hire more people to make them. Then they had to hire more people to sell them and service them, and so on. And it changed their lives. In a similar way, you can see on the left-hand side that this is how you got from here to where in a bus, and that Kia was the only one that made buses. And you can see you met a lot of interesting people on a three-wheeled bus. If you guys have 2 months to waste, you should go to Korea in July and August, because it is a miserable place to live. The humidity is just awful. And every day we would come home from working on one of those 2 months, and I was just sweating buckets. But our church had rules about how much clothing you had to keep on. And so we went down to the bare minimum, and at the end of the day, spread ourselves out on the floor in cement and pray to God that he would send us a breeze. And breezes were the only air conditioners available to us at that time. And you can see that was Clay on the back row in Busan, sweating buckets. And I remember one evening, there was kind of a buzz outside. And I went out and asked the guy who was working deep into the night, "What are you guys doing up there in the hill?" And they said, "Oh, we're making a fan." And I said, "A fan?" And he said, "Yeah. What's unique about it is it goes around like this." And the sound was whoosh, whoosh. And for us missionaries, it spent day after day getting rejected. To see that God had brought this miracle was unbelievable to us. And the company that made that car, or that bus, that fan, was a little company called Samsung. And they changed the world in many different ways. But I hope you can see that if you want to create innovations that make products affordable and accessible, going to the bottom of the market is the mechanism by which it's done. And then you have to develop the supply chain behind and before in order to create the growth that we hope to achieve in growth, in creating new growth. Sometimes, as we have gone through this study, we've wondered, why does a nation like Venezuela, they have so much oil, and yet they never can become prosperous. They don't know what to do with all of that oil, but they do something with it that's not, who knows. And we recognize that there's an answer in this theory, and that is a nation like Venezuela or Nigeria, when they go into a nation to drill a well, their purpose in drilling that well is not to help the nation become prosperous. Their purpose is to take a well and make it cheaper and faster and more efficient. And so going after no oil or steel, their purpose is not to grow. And so you see this around the world where oil companies haven't affected nations' growth potential at all. And we are critical of what the oil companies have been doing, but that's not their purpose. Their purpose is to create these assets that you can drive the cost forever. It helped me understand why Mexico has been such a basket case for so many years in many parts of Mexico. And I realized what was going on is our car companies like Ford would go to Mexico and under NAFTA build a plant. And then if somebody built a better plant somewhere in Southeast Asia, in Mexico they would shut it down, move to Southeast Asia and build it up there. And time after time, you would see investments in Africa, in Mexico, being created, shut down, move. without creating a lot of prosperity in that area. And now we realize that what Ford, in this instance, were doing differently is their investments in Mexico were efficiency innovations by making the same products just cheaper. If instead people had gone to Mexico with a market creating innovation by making a car so affordable and accessible that millions of people who historically have not been access to cars, now they could have one. And it would be created in Mexico by Mexicans, designed by Mexicans, and so on. Anyway, it's been quite an interesting study to understand how that theory has helped us. I'll just ask one final, maybe two questions as it relates to push versus pull. There have been invested in nations around the world trillions of dollars by the World Bank and others to try to help them grow. And what you'd find is you'd develop a plan, get the money from Washington, go to Nigeria, start something up, and it would appear to have promise. But after 2 or 3 years, this broke, and then that broke, and then that broke, and they weren't able to keep this thing going in a sustainable way. They'd invest in better schools for their children, and they could teach them as well as they possibly could. But in a few years, if there wasn't a job waiting for the children, they shut down. And we decided that we would call that kind of innovation push innovation. And instead, what we needed to create in the emerging worlds is pull innovations. There's a friend, a former student of mine, who helped me write this book. And he was raised in Indonesia first, and then came to Nigeria. And he and his friend decided to start a new company called Indomie. And up to that point in Africa, people didn't eat noodles. They looked at noodles as worms. And so they bought a company in Indonesia and brought it into Nigeria and figured out how to operate this thing, making noodles. And they found that the farmers weren't very good at keeping this recipe consistent. And so they had to buy the farms that fed their factory. And then they figured out that they needed engineers. And so they had to hire people and train them how to be engineers in a mechanical way. And then they were developing these noodles, and they'd ship the products in their truck on one side, and roughly 20% of the value created in the factory disappeared by the time it got home. And so they had to hire people to own the cars and trucks in order to operate the material. And then what they found is when they got it to the port, people were so dishonest that the company had to build now the largest port in all of Africa so that they didn't lose what they were making. And what's happened to it is really quite remarkable. Just over the last 15 years, the company has invested $150 million just in investments, millions of dollars in taxes, complete new distribution system, because the trucks kept running into potholes, and ultimately the company had to build new roads and bridges in order to make the system work. They had to reorganize how they did the agriculture. They had to change electric and water treatment in order to reach the people who liked it. Created 3,500 jobs, 13 factories, and so on. And what they find is if you try to make better roads and bridges, or better schools, or better healthcare facilities, if you push it, it doesn't create real growth. But you have to do something economically that is real, and then have to go into the population and pull the people who need to be taught. And we learned a lot about this and realized that this difference between pull and push is critical. And finally, it in an effort to make a nation become prosperous, if you have dishonest people, it won't work. You have to wait until people are honest and follow all of the rules. Well, if any of you have ever looked at the history of America, America is a horrible example of a nation where we don't follow the rules. And the way you get honesty is you need to have a company that follows honesty rules and deal with other companies that want to be honest as well. And little by little, people will become more honest by creating companies that follow the rules and then reach in and pull honest companies out as well. But if we wait until we have become honest, we will be waiting for a very long time. Well, those are my thoughts. Scott, is it okay? Do you have guts to try this on?
I think this will be an excellent time.
Thank you, Clay. It's now my pleasure to introduce Scott Cook, who will be joining Clay on stage for the second part of our program for a fireside chat. So Scott is co-founder of Intuit and a graduate of Harvard Business School. He founded Intuit in 1983. After stepping down as CEO, he's remained as chairman of the company now with more than $55 billion of market cap and continues to work with teams across the company. He and Clay are longtime collaborators and friends. Their 2005 article published in Harvard Business Review was really influential for people around the world in thinking about how products that do the job is a new way of thinking about redefining market segmentation. They continue to be longtime collaborators and friends as well. Here at Exponential and CHM, we're especially thrilled to welcome Scott as a thought leader in innovation himself and the way that he's transforming the world for small businesses and entrepreneurs. And thank you also to Scott and Intuit for being longtime friends and supporters of the museum. And now 5 numbers about Scott. 0 is the number of VCs, 0, who invested in Intuit after pitching to 25 of them in 1984. 2 was the number of months it took for QuickBooks to become the market leader. 220 is the ratio of Intuit's current market cap compared to its IPO in 1993. 50 is the percentage of direct reports to Intuit's newly promoted CEO who are women. Let's hear it for that. Thank you. And 341 are the number of Intuit employees' kids who have won scholarships from Signe and Scott. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Scott.
Well, I think it's a real honor to be up here. It was in, some of us are almost old enough to remember 1776 when Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations. And now in 2019, you'll publish the book on the growth in the wealth of nations. So, which is available at Amazon for pre-order now. I pre-ordered mine today for delivery in mid-January. I had to do it. It's okay to do a book plug, right?
Oh, thank you.
Okay. Let me, let's start with on nations. It is a paradox, to me at least, how you could have a wealthy country like the United States right next door to a country like Mexico that has been behind for so long.
Yes.
How could that be? And then was NAFTA a good idea or not?
Well, I puzzled about this for 30 years of my life, you know. And it wasn't until I realized that there are 3 different types of innovations. And one of those 3 is the one that would create economic growth. And that is one that makes it affordable and accessible so that a much larger population can own and use the products. And the other 2 types of investments, efficiency innovations and sustaining innovations, their purpose is not to create growth. And therefore, there's a lot of capital in Mexico, but it's not for this purpose. They have a lot of oil. But when you go in to drill oil, you're investing in efficiency innovations to make it more efficient to take it out. The purpose is not to create growth. So if I were there and wanted to change the trajectory in Mexico, how might I do it? And what I would do, I think, is go deeply into electric cars, but not to go at the high end to compete against Tesla, but come down at the bottom of the market, designed by Mexicans, for Mexican roads, and it will create a much larger population of dealerships and distribution systems and so on. And I really do believe, Scott, that that is a mechanism by which Mexico could become prosperous. And we put into place NAFTA. You look at where money has been implemented, almost none of that money has been used in Mexico to create jobs. And it'd be great if Americans could recognize that, use the law, and pull it back in. Because there are just a lot of, there's so much so much investment in Mexico for the Mexicans. And one possibility would be, down in Florida somewhere is where Disney is. The vast majority of Mexicans in Mexico have never been to Disney. And there are ways to develop, fabricate an instance where Mexicans could go to Disney by ever needing to leave home. And the way you would do it is you would build a facility about this size, 3 stories high, and then install rides that are not any rides, but they are the kind of rides that when something mirrors something else.
Virtual reality?
Virtual reality. And people can get on the row, and then you turn it on, and you would experience Shrek with more definity than people do when they go to Disneyland. But you make it affordable and accessible, and then you operate this place for a month, shut it down, turn on Cinderella for another month, and then shut it down. And actually it's kind of a neat system, but you would make it, do what you need, and it would become much more prosperous.
Well, let me ask about China, compared to Mexico, or maybe compared to Russia. So, at least from the headlines, it would seem that China was the wellspring or the center of low-end, cost-reducing manufacturing. And companies around the world outsourced their manufacturing to China.
Yeah.
Which maybe didn't work so well in Mexico, but China seems to have been on a tear.
Yeah.
For the last 35 years. So how do the theories explain China?
Well, our sense is that in China, the types of markets that were the driver of economic growth in China were making it affordable and accessible. So Galan's made...
The car manufacturer.
Yeah. And then another one with the same name, they made air conditioners. And they made cars. They made refrigerators. And they were the main engines of economic growth. What was going on in Russia next door is they were engaging with large corporations around the world as efficiency innovations to drive the cost and distribute the profits to the West around the world. But there really has been very little investments for market-creating growth in Russia. And so our sense is the reason for the difference between China and Russia is China has invested to make it affordable and accessible. And Russia has invested to maximizing free cash flow.
Just like in the corner of your chart, the people maximizing cash flow.
Yeah.
So is the theory applicable to all developing countries? Or are there some that are just impossibly behind?
Well, I think there are some nations that are impoverished, they're very behind. And the ones that I'd struggle with are nations in which Russia, where in religious terms, they're not dealing with each other in the right way. it's very hard to change those kinds of cultures in some nations. And in a similar way, but anyway, but that's my guess. But the big answer is I don't know the answer
to whether some are impervious to change.
Yeah.
Well, let's ask about 3 countries in order. And if you were hired by the president of each country, and he came to you and said, Clay, what should I do to continue developing my country? From whatever point we are today, going forward, how should I grow the prosperity? The 3 countries will be in order: first the Philippines, and then China, and then the US. So on the Philippines, if Duterte came to you and said, what should I do? And he said, I'm not sure I can do electric cars. So what would you advise him?
The question you need to ask is there non-consumption of anything in that nation? And by saying non-consumption, it is, so Scott, you have looked at me now for an hour, and I haven't read any books during this hour. And during that time, there are other people who might have read books, but it wasn't me. I was a non-consumer, while others were consumers. And so I go around and see where is there non-consumption of something where people want it, but it's not accessible. And that's an opportunity for growth. And most often, those are consumer products, not industrial products. And that's where I think I would look first. The next question was Russia.
Well, let's pick, so I think on the last one, your example of the instant noodles was an example of finding food calories people wanted, and a way to fill that with a affordable product.
Yes.
Okay, well, let's pick either your advice to President Xi of China, or you could pick Donald Trump of the United States. Pick one. Who would you?
I just am so disgusted with Trump that I can't answer that question.
Let's pick. Okay. So what would you do advising President Xi then, whose economy is now quite advanced, growing like a weed, large 400 million middle-class citizens? What would your advice be to him?
I would keep trying to drive growth in the established markets to find more opportunities where people haven't yet. They haven't. There's a lot of non-consumption.
Okay.
And create a situation where they'll pull it into their lives. And education, for all of its, we need it so badly, but you can't create growth by pushing education into the marketplace. There need to be companies that need education so that they will pull it in. And I think your companies are a great example of creating needs where the customers will then pull it into the market. There has to be a job to be done, and then fulfill it with something of the sort that you do.
So last question on global development. Many countries, the US, the rich countries, have pursued a set of institutions and policies to help the world grow. And we're going to do this lightning round style. So I'll list a global institution or a method of helping the world grow, and you can do thumbs up, that's probably a good idea and it's helpful, or maybe that's not the thing to bank on. Okay, so lightning round, you got your thumb ready. First one, the World Bank. WTO. Direct foreign aid. Halfway, okay. Philanthropists from rich countries. Okay, halfway. And last, fair trade policies where consumers try to buy things that help farmers. Up, okay. So now it's moving away from comparisons between countries. Let's look within countries. So the headlines in the US suggest that prosperity in the last decade has really been a thing in the United States, mostly on the coasts and in the cities. And things are different in the rural and in the center of the country. I think there's something similar we were talking about India, where India's development has been spurred a lot in the south, but the north and especially the northeast lag. Any sense of how you'd apply theory there to explain those regional differences?
Boy, these are great questions, Scott. In order to answer it, I have to follow my rule, which is that a theory, I have to ask, does the theory have an opinion? Mm-hmm. And so I'd go in the middle, and if I built factories because it's cheap labor that I can export from that high-cost factory to the coasts or whatever, those are efficiency innovations and it won't create growth. So I got to find people who are market creating, meaning they need something affordable and accessible, and build a product in that location for those people. And I noticed that, this is just a silly example, but Deere.
The tractor people.
That's right. And there are so many people like me who would love to have a sit-down experience, even when my car isn't that big. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think we just have one manufacturer of that product. Mm. And I'd look around or I would go to Mexico City, to Oklahoma City, mm-hmm. and create Disney, Mexico. Mm-hmm. You know,
like you described for
that's right. Mm-hmm. Or create. Anyway, that's what I try to do. Is the middle is in tough shape, but the solution is down below, not investments from above.
All right. So last question before we go to the audience questions. So I think some of you have been writing questions on cards. Let's move to technology. Some of your original work was done with some technology industries, studying the disk drive industry, for example. Then you applied those theories to digital equipment, the leading mini-computer company at one time. Now, moving more currently, as you observed technology industries and companies in the last 10 to 15 years, do you see ways where they either amplify your theories or, in fact, suggest new theories?
The companies in the past that still grew really did follow the rules from the original Innovator's Dilemma and Innovator's Solution. And that is that if you want to create new waves of growth when disruption occurs, you have to separate out a completely independent organization. And if you try to attack that disruptive innovation from within the core, it'll get killed. And the rules are very clear about that. There are no exceptions, you know. And yet, what have we done with technology? And IBM caught the new wave of disruption. They made the mainframe computer, and then the mini computer, they caught that, were very powerful at that level. Then they caught the personal computer, and it looked as if they had been beaten by the theory. They kept their prosperity. But then they got CEOs who stopped following the theory. And so the CEO shut down the laptop, then they shut down the smartphone. And there isn't an IBM smartphone anywhere in this room. And in a similar way, Hewlett-Packard caught the mini computer world, very, very successful. The personal computer, very successful. The personal computer, reasonably so. And then the next CEO wouldn't set up a separate organization. And the flow of capital just shut down. And there isn't a single smartphone in this room. And
From HP, yeah.
Yeah, and the same is with Dell. And so I've developed a sense of, what's the word? I believe that the theories, the way you develop a good theory, Scott, is you have to wait until you see something that is an anomaly, and figure out why didn't it work out the way the theory said it would be. And you say, that's a great opportunity to create a better theory. And so far, the theory is something to follow.
Well, now we have some questions from the audience, and these are big picture questions. So maybe they'll be the kind of anomalies to develop a new theory. So the first one here, AI and related innovations, will they lead to aggressive job growth in transportation and industrial engineering? And I guess there's the flip side, will they lead to a massive job loss?
Yeah.
So where are you on that?
Well, there's one of the theories from our course that is called interdependence and modularity. And what that theory says is if I'm going to change one thing in the system, I have to change all kinds of other things in the system. So if you don't recognize all of the interdependencies in the system, you fail. And you have to wait until it's modular in order to do the work of what you're imagining. And when I look at things like this, I worry that the smart the cars that shoot. This is my stroke coming back.
Which Teslas or
yeah. If
self-driving autonomous cars.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
I look at that and I say, gosh, wouldn't that be great to own? But then I think about all of the interdependent problems associated with behavior and purchase and use, that I think I'll wait and let somebody else work out all of those interdependencies, and then I'll come in like Dell came in at the bottom of the market. But I think in a similar way, AI, yeah, they're interdependencies.
Well, we have another auto question. So, Clay, you keep coming back to the auto as a growth engine. Why not look to investment in public transportation instead?
It could. You know, we have sorry to do it with another theory, but there's a theory that you and I collectively thought about called the jobs to be done theory. And what it says is when I wake up in the morning and go outside, I realize that I have a job to do. And if I have this job to do, then I have to go out and find something and pull it into my life to get the job done perfectly. And if I develop a product that you don't need, then it's really hard for me to invest to develop a product for you. And I have a sense that public transportation, they don't have a job to do. There are a lot of jobs that arise in their lives. They like to play games. They like to learn, to do all things like that.
So these are the jobs that consumers have in their life that they want to do.
That's right. And so if I invest in those kinds of things to make it happy and affordable, I bet you we'd find them using more public transportation than if we do it by pushing that.
Well, here's maybe a metaphysical one. If the bottom of the pyramid is prosperous, does wealth inequality matter?
Wouldn't it be wonderful if
Yes.
it didn't matter?
Wouldn't it be wonderful if the bottom of the pyramid was prosperous?
Yes. Isn't that a great concept? Holy cow. I wonder who wrote it.
Yeah. Well, let's move to this one. This one is a tough world problem. How do you solve the refugee crisis? What methods of prosperity can help them?
Wow.
I told you these were big.
Well, let's go back to the time when the Vietnam War was done, and we had several million people who we just kind of pushed out in the ocean with no way to deal with them. How was it ultimately resolved? I think in one way or another, the people were pulled into certain nations where they needed people like that. And they weren't pushed by people who didn't need them. So I think there's a rule in that way. And I never thought about it before, but Honduras and so on, the theory would say we need to go to the bottom of the pyramid and how to make exciting places like India. Anyway.
So I think, that makes sense. Well, the comparison might be to refugees from Syria. Many of them are penned up in camps in Turkey and other places that don't want them, so they're fenced in, making it hard for them to.
Yes.
They've kind of pushed themselves into the country because they had no choice.
Yes.
But now the country doesn't allow them to contribute and to grow. Where in the U.S. with the Vietnam era refugees, they weren't penned up. They went into the economy. The economy wanted hardworking people, even if they came with no resources, and they've flourished. Is that maybe the comparison?
That's a great example, and I've never thought about that. But that's got to be true, Scott.
But your push and pull.
Yeah.
Well, now after those global grand issues, maybe one more tackleable. So how can a company continue to be successful? If you grow by creating a new market, must you use that profit to find more new markets to create?
Well, I think we worry about this a lot. If engineering makes it, we keep engineering jobs out of our economy, what's going to happen? And I think that there are three broad sectors of the economy for which there always will be as long as I can see, there can be create growth, provided that we engineer things correctly. And those three categories are entertainment. There seem to be always a job to be done in that. Education. People always want education. They don't realize that, but that's proven to be true. The number of people applying for two-year degrees shows that there is a very strong need for more education. And then thankfully we're all getting older and we're creating jobs in that way. Can I talk to you a little bit about how do we measure our lives?
Yes, I was just going to ask, so please. This is your book before this last one,
Yes.
which is a different book than any before, and you have quite a story to tell that I'd love you to share.
Well, one of the things I've decided, Scott, is that God doesn't hire accountants or statisticians in heaven. And I've been puzzling, why would he hire some people and not others? And then at some point I recognized that at its core, you and I have finite minds. And for us to figure out what's going on in the world, we have to aggregate things up. We have to figure out how many invoices and outvoices and so on. And you need to have accountants and statisticians to figure out what's going on in the world. And we get a sense also that there are so many numbers to analyze that we have a sense of hierarchy. People who preside over bigger numbers are more important than people who preside over smaller numbers. And that's because we have finite minds. Then I realized one day that the difference is that God has an infinite mind. And because he has an infinite mind, he doesn't have to aggregate people up in terms of people of groups or numbers. God doesn't have to aggregate people into numbers in order to have a perfect understanding of what's going on in the world. And when I realized that God he truly doesn't have to aggregate us up, then I had to ask, well, what do I do with my life? And I realized that the way God would measure my life is by the individual people who I help to become better people, because that's how God will measure my life. And that's the purpose of my life. And I've thought about this a lot, about how can I live my life so that in the end I will be judged to be worthy. And my friends have had an unfortunate history. When I was at the Harvard Business School, Jeff Skilling was my classmate. And he got put in the slammer for a while, you know. And he was a good guy.
So you knew Jeff Skilling, who later became president of Enron.
Yes, that's right. And then I got a Rhodes Scholarship, and there were 72 of us who got the scholarship that year to go to Oxford. 2 of the 72 got put in jail. And these are good guys, you know. And I knew them when they were young, and yet they got put in the slammer. And why would that happen? So I can promise you, Scott, that there wasn't a single member of my graduating class who got married and had a strategy to go out and get divorced and raise their children who hate their guts. But a much larger population of my peers than I ever imagined implemented a strategy to get divorced, you know. And I think we need to take this very seriously. The way God will measure our lives is by the individual people who we help. And the people who we need to be the most careful about are our families and our children. And every day we go home having worked hard at work and forgetting the way God measures our lives is how we invest our time for a better purpose. And I hope that these guys, when they're going home tonight, will think about this and be sure that every day we're investing time that will help the people who matter the most in our lives spend time helping good people to become better people.
Not yet. I'd like to follow up, because there was another chapter in your book on how will you measure your life that talked about living to your principles and how maybe some people get tempted to just this once.
Yes.
And maybe that happened to Jeff Skilling. And you have maybe his story, your story. Walk us through living to one's principles.
Well, so I went to the Harvard Business School, and it was a driving culture at the time. You worked very late at night, and but Christine and I had no money, and BCG paid good money, and so we decided that we'd take the boat and jump in and work for the Boston Consulting Group for a couple of years, and then go out and get a real job. And after we'd been there for a couple of months, Scott, who was our project leader, knocked on the door and said, well, I've scheduled a project meeting on Sunday at 2 o'clock. And this is what I want you to bring, because as you know, on Monday we have an important client meeting, and we've got to nail it all well. And I looked at Mike and I said, oof, Mike, I forgot to tell you this, but my wife and I are religious people, and we made a decision when we took the position at BCG that I would never work on Sunday. And Mike was just bonkers because everybody at BCG works on Sundays, you know. And he said, can't you go to see your leader just this once and explain in this particular extenuating circumstance, just this once I can. And I said, I can't. And he said, I don't know anything about your church, but our church, if we need to do something just this once, we just do it. And then we find somebody who will forgive us, and everything is fine, you know. Anyway, I said for 30 years I've been hoping that our church would have one of those outs, and I don't think they got any. Anyway, he was mad, but Mike blustered away, and he came back an hour later and he said, look, talk to everybody else on the team. They understand. And we decided to meet on Saturday at 2 p.m. And I remember going like this. And I said, Mike, I'm sorry, I have to tell you, but Christine and I decided that I wouldn't work on Saturday either. And Mike really blew up, because everybody did it, you know, and he said, can't you just this once? And I said, look, if I spend my time on Saturday working on this project so that the partners in the project get even richer, what that means is I'm not investing my time on my family. And if I'm really serious about my life, I need to spend my time investing in times to strengthen my family. And for all, God bless us, Mike, but my purpose is not to help the partners get more rich. And he blustered away. And then he came back about an hour later and he said, look, I talked to the team again. And do you ever work on Fridays? So, turns out in the 5 years that I worked at BCG, nobody ever asked me to work on Sunday or Saturday again. But the bigger deal, Scott, was just last month I got a brochure that are given to all of the new hires at BCG, and right there in black and white is a statement that at BCG we urge you never to work on Sunday and to find another day to be free as well. And I just thought this was a good thing to do.
This was a good thing. Well, thank you, Clay. You're an inspiration.
You're kind, Scott. God bless you.